We are live here, MythVision podcast. You don't want to miss today's episode. I mean that. I have literally called this my new Bible. I reference this book all the time as far as educating people to understand what the God of the Bible really is, who the God of the Bible really is, or gods, especially if you take Yahweh usurping El. You're going to want to check out this episode. I'm going to take a little different approach than the other interviews you've heard with Dr. Francesca Stavrakopoulou, and let's have some fun. Let our intro begin. We are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision podcast. I am hot. I'm out in my garage. My AC unit isn't working, and it is blistering hot out here in North Carolina. But it's okay. I'm willing to suffer for you, my friends. So with that being said, welcome to the channel again, Dr. Francesca Stavrakopoulou.
Hi. It's nice to be back.
Thank you so much for joining me. You have such, well, I was on your Wikipedia page just showing people, I don't even know where to begin on how to present your background. You've been part of documentaries and shows, The Bible's Buried Secrets. You have an extensive CV, if you will, with a lot of credentials. If you don't mind, tell us what your book is about and, if you will, some of your background as we're diving in.
Yeah. So the book is basically about the early career of the God who's described and adored in the Bible, and it's basically tracking his early career from kind of the late Bronze, early Iron Age through up into, well, basically to about the 6th century of the Common Era. But what I do is I basically do an anatomy of God. I argue that this was a deity who was understood to have a corporeal form. He had a human-shaped body and a male, masculine body. And I basically try to explore the reasons why this deity was gradually disembodied culturally and theologically to become the God that we're kind of more familiar with today in Western cultural constructs. So, yeah, that's what the book's about. I'm a professor of Hebrew Bible and ancient religion at the University of Exeter in the UK. I'm an atheist. Always have been, always will be. And I did all my degrees at Oxford and my postdoctoral work before moving to Exeter.
Absolutely amazing. Your book was, I must admit, it's my favorite book right now, honestly.
Yay.
I've been reading a lot of different books and I'm like, okay, this is by far my favorite one. So I figure I'd just lay out the outline of this episode because it's difficult with your time and my schedule and all of us trying to figure out what works.
And the time difference.
The time difference that plays a significant role. So I have some questions that I have come up with throughout your book, and then we can get to the Q&A, allowing anybody who super chats to get your question answered. And we will try to do that in a timely fashion, of course, but still get your question answered, because I know there's a lot of people who have a lot of questions for you, and I still have questions for you. So I'm impressed. I reread it again. This is the second go around, and I realized I missed so many things. I also want to mention, if anybody who's watching this really wants to help us out, you can join our Patreon. I'll let everybody know early. I'm going to be interviewing John Dominic Crossan here in the next week down in Florida while I'm on vacation. I'm working while on vacation with my family, interviewing ex-cult members, you name it. Like, I'm all about this. I am a humanist as well. So if you're interested in learning more and helping us here at MythVision, you could join and help us out. Okay. I love this book. I cannot, there's not a, I can't put enough energy into that. I wish I could download it, just plug it in, and people could go, oh, he really, really loves this book. But I must start somewhere, and it's with this goddess called Inanna. Inanna and Yahweh. And on your book, page 202, I made sure I stopped it. I wanted to read something, if I can. Did you want to grab your book, by the way? I
was going to say, my God, I can't remember what's on page. No, whatever. No, it's the book's it. You read it.
Yeah, and I don't
got a copy of my book.
A miracle, an atheist miracle happened because I ended up getting this copy in America. Remember, I don't know how I did.
Yeah, that is amazing. It's come out. Look at this. It's come out in Italian recently, which looks very beautiful.
Ooh, so they're changing it up.
Yeah, like the German cover is different, and yeah, it's all yeah, because obviously the US cover is different too. So
awesome. Well, I'm going to read and obnoxiously have your book up while I do so. So for in Hinduana, I hope I'm saying this right, Inanna is a deity so powerful that her divinity surpasses even that of the highest gods, An and Enlil, who have willingly ceded their wisdom to her. In your vast wisdom amongst all the gods, you alone are majestic, Hinduana exclaims. In this poem, Inanna not only governs the forms of wisdom graciously bestowed upon mortals, such as expertise in warfare, ritual, economics, sex, and medicine, but curates and controls the divine wisdom underpinning the very foundations of the cosmos. To destroy, to create, to cut apart, to establish, Inanna are yours. To turn a man into a woman and a woman into a man, Inanna are yours. A large and expansive heart, Inanna, are yours. Almost 2,000 years later, another poet was crediting just one deity with the wisdom to create and destroy, and for him, it was Yahweh.
Yeah.
Do you want to comment on this just briefly?
Yeah, so that's so there I'm talking about a particular poem from Mesopotamia that was written by what we understand to be the world's, the first named author that we know in the history of the world, who's a woman, Enheduanna. She was the daughter of a king and also a priestess. But she, I mean, whether or not she actually wrote this poem is kind of debated by scholars. It may be that it was a poem to which her name was ascribed. But nonetheless, what it reflects when she's kind of praising the goddess Inanna, who was, she's also known as Ishtar. So Inanna is her Sumerian name. Ishtar is her Akkadian name. So these are two different languages that were used throughout the ancient Near East. But yeah, she's praising the goddess Inanna as basically being just, you know, the most supreme deity imaginable. And what she's doing when she's talking about the various divine qualities and functions and roles that Inanna has, she's saying that even the high god, so the god An, who is basically, you know, heaven, has given Inanna, his daughter, these particular gifts. It's a way of kind of talking about this kind of fluidity that we see in divine functions and roles, in that you can, even in a deeply complex polytheistic system, you can single out a particular deity, and that deity is held to basically almost incorporate all divine qualities and roles and functions. And Inanna is incredibly important because she was probably the most important, you know, across ancient Southwest Asia, but particularly in Mesopotamia. She was probably the most important deity in some ways, you know, the longest, her importance kind of stretched the longest throughout, you know, over millennia. So it's an incredible poem. But yeah, like it kind of shows this very elevated, sophisticated, complex role of divine functions for a goddess that are the kinds of things that we find, you know, thousands of years later in the Hebrew Bible. We find that Yahweh is being described in similar ways.
Would you be willing to say that Yahweh's Johnny come lately? That's how I feel. I mean, I hate to be that way because a lot of people go, oh, well, atheists like you are antagonistic. You're trying to find something before. And all you have to do is have a Justin Martyr come on the scene and go, well, Satan knew, that's why. But yeah, it's still silly.
Yeah. Like the thing is that it's very difficult. You know, one of the big kind of theological premises on which a lot of biblical theology is founded is the idea that Yahweh was somehow extraordinary, that ancient Israelite religion was somehow different from the religions of surrounding peoples and cultures, and that somehow that extraordinary quality means that this deity is a deity wholly unlike any other deity across ancient Southwest Asia. you know, that's what we find, you know, Yahweh himself saying in the Bible all the time. In Isaiah, in Deutero-Isaiah, so chapters 40 to 55, he's like, I am God, there is no other, there's nobody else like me, I am the only kind of deity. But, you know, historically, we know that that's just not the case. You know, things are rarely, I'm not saying that you know, that you don't get innovative shifts in religious thinking and religious imagination. Of course you do. But there's nothing particularly unusual about Yahweh. There's nothing particularly extraordinary about him. So for the various different sorts of roles and functions and titles and you know, we find, you know, examples of those used much earlier of lots of different types of deities. So this was part and parcel of a much broader cultural landscape, and Yahweh, if you like, is kind of like a local iteration of broader understandings of what deities, you know, successful deities, frontline deities, were supposed to be doing.
I must skip to something interesting in my commentary about Inanna, or Ishtar, if you will. And I'm vindicating, Dr. Richard Carrier wrote an article about dying and rising gods. So I made this really cool documentary little video about this that I thought was interesting. And he talked about how Inanna, this goddess, was, you know, with all this powers kind of lowered or defamed, if you will, taking off, stripped naked, then made into a corpse, then hung on a hook for 3 days and 3 nights, and then is brought back to life, or something like 3 days, something to the same motif we see with Jesus. We see it with Jonah. We see it with other mythologies. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, certainly that particular myth about Ishtar Inanna, I talk about in the book. And it's very much the goddess's decision that she wants to take over the underworld. I mean, she's a seriously kick-ass, ambitious goddess. I adore her. But she's that idea of her sort of being stripped of all her divine, her bling, basically, her accessories. These were more than just kind of decorative items that were worn on divine bodies. A bit like high status human bodies, these were ways of making the body, of rendering a body complete. So by stripping off, you know, her headgear and her necklaces, she kind of deliberately diminishes herself because she has to in order to enter the underworld. But yeah, some people think that that's an example of a dying and rising god. It's not quite. I mean, yes, she's turned into a corpse, a kind of like a hunk of meat, basically. So it's about her kind of debasement in very material terms. The whole debate about dying and rising gods is really complicated. I think the main ancient Southwest Asian, pre-Christian ancient Southwest Asian myth that we can certainly say is a dying and talks about a dying and rising god is a myth concerning Baal from Ugarit. So late Bronze Age, Syria, the city-state of Ugarit, the modern site name is Ras Shamra. And in that, Baal is defeated by the god Mot, who's the god of death, who swallows him, because death is a swallower. Which is where we get all that imagery in the Bible about, you know, when the ground opens up and swallows kind of idolatrous priests. That's exactly what's going on there. The underworld swallows
Jonah, the fish.
Yeah, exactly. Jonah being swallowed by the fish. Exactly. But yeah, with Baal, he is certainly dies because his sister Anat and the sun goddess Shapsh go into the underworld to find him, and they find his corpse. He's buried in a tomb, and then yeah, about 3 days later, he is restored. So that, I mean, and you know, and that is like I said, there's very little in the Bible that's completely original.
I love this. Thank you for coming on. You're awesome. So God's being so concerned with food. This is something as well. But before we get to that, Ezekiel and Genesis. This is something I thought was fascinating because I always read the Bible as a Christian and always thought Genesis is the beginning, Revelation at the end. It's written in the chronological order in which they were really written or something, because you're not told all these things. But you mentioned about this in Ezekiel, you know, it talks about this king, this ruler who says in his heart, which is like where you think in the ancient world, the organs, or your heart, which is down here, is actually where you think, not your brain. But we're not going to go there because I think you said that plenty of times on your other episodes. I really want to get something unique out of you in terms of this. So I will rise above the throne of God. I will sit upon, he wants to go up the holy mountain and sit on the throne of El, the high god. And this was written before Genesis's account, or Genesis.
Yeah, so it's kind of complicated. So the story that we have so basically Genesis 2 and 3, the story of the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, it's not a fall, it's an expulsion. has a lot of similar motifs to a lot of material that we find in Ezekiel, and in that material in Ezekiel is probably older. So that's probably, you know, kind of 6th century, but drawing on an older motif, whereas the story that we find in Genesis is probably about 5th century. But what both are, but kind of, they both share the same mythic kind of schema or trope, in which you have this, the first human, who across ancient Southwest Asian mythologies, the first human was generally understood to be a paradigm of the king. And the king was understood, you know, the role of kingship, because a lot of these texts and myths were produced within royal high status contexts. So the first man is the paradigmatic man is the royal figure, the king, who is made and appointed to perform various tasks on behalf of the deity in the earthly realm. So the Ezekiel myth does talk about an anonymous ruler who, in the context in which we find the myth, is probably to be identified as one of the foreign kings that's harassing Yahweh's own people, like an Assyrian king or a Babylonian king, or possibly an Egyptian king, but probably Assyrian or Babylonian. And he says, you know, I will ascend the holy mountains, I will make myself like a god. I will sit on the throne, on the seat of the gods in the divine council on the top of the holy mountain. And God, who here is the terms used for God are both El and Yahweh. He's like, no, you're not, I'm not having this at all. I'm going to, you know, you're going to die like any mortal. You're not a god. You know, one of the kind of qualities of divine nature in some ways is kind of perpetual immortality. So even if, like Baal, you die, you don't die forever. You don't stay dead. You know, you come back. So yeah, this king is expelled from this holy mountain, which in Ezekiel is also called Eden. It's this beautiful garden of God. He's expelled and sent down into the underworld, where he obviously dies, and then his corpse is exhumed and trampled by enemies. So this is about kind of wiping him out in every possible way. In the ancient world, you only exist for as long as you're remembered. So even after death, you have a post-mortem existence and you continue to have a social relationship with the living. But if your tomb is desecrated, if your bones or your remains are destroyed, if you're eaten by wild animals and shat out on the ground, that basically is completely eradicating you in a material sense, and therefore you can no longer be remembered, and you no longer exist. So that's what happens to this king. But yeah, it looks like a lot of that myth that we find, in a way, that Genesis material and the Ezekiel material are both later reflections of what looks to be an earlier kind of mythic trope about one divine or semi-divine figure trying to usurp an older, more senior divine figure and kind of being taken to task for it.
It just always excites me to learn this stuff. What about the gods and food, right? So they're always concerned about food and not eating their food in the ancient world, or says gods being so concerned with food and not you humans, mortals, eating their food in the ancient world. Did the temple's demise change the understanding of God eating in Jewish thought? So I kind of wanted to like get the idea, you know, we're talking about him being a corporeal deity who needs to eat. Now he doesn't have food.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, because when we use the language of sacrifice in our own cultures today, we have the sense of that it's something like that we're giving up something, you know, that it's hard for us to give up something. It's something very precious. But sacrifice in the ancient world, I mean, you didn't just sacrifice living things, you know, animals or the humans sometimes. You could also sacrifice all the other things that were important and sort of the mainstay products of human consumption. So you can sacrifice wine and beer and honey and oil and bread and fruit and cakes. And so sacrifices in temple economies were a way of not only getting money into the temple, but it was a way of sharing a meal with the deity. So say if I was a worshipper, actually, let's say you, because we're talking about a very masculinist kind of culture here. If you wanted to go to the temple because you want to petition the deity for a particular kind of blessing, you might take, I don't know, a lamb or a couple of pigeons, and you would take these to the temple. The priest would sacrifice it on your behalf, and then some of that food would be burnt on the altar as food for the deity, who would smell. We're constantly told in the Hebrew Bible that Yahweh is attracted to the sweet aroma, the pleasant aroma of sacrifice. Kind of, you know how like when you can smell the barbecue and you're like, God, that smells really good. It's like that. So it calls the deity into this social relationship around the altar with humans. And so the deity would eat part of that sacrifice normally, and then the priests and other ritual officials would eat the rest, and then you would also get a little part as well. So you're kind of sharing in a meal with the deity. And this was a way of basically forging and maintaining a social relationship with the god. So just as the same way that food times, like meal times, are important social family occasions for all of us, you know, think about the great, you know, the big festivals that we celebrate, whether it's Thanksgiving or Christmas or whatever it is, you know, food and a particular kind of feast is a focal part of that. And that's because it's about this sense of bringing a community, a group of people together. You forge and maintain social identities and relationships. And that's exactly what temple sacrifice was about.
As far as the eating that really caught my attention, you did it really well in making me think of something I never thought about. And that is, God just got done flooding all humanity. Let's forget that there's earlier Mesopotamian myths that really give us the precedence for why this is. And they kind of give you a different reason in the biblical account, getting God off the hook for just being annoyed for noises and whatnot. But here is like this complete genocide of the human race. And here's this one guy he finds is like, well, you know what? I like Noah, okay? And his family can have this little group. Noah gets the barbecue up as soon as dry land comes up, and God smells it.
Yeah.
And am I correct in assessing this and saying God was ready to eradicate all, and then he smelt that meat, and he said, why did I kill all these humans?
It's not so much that he said, yeah, it's not so much he says, why did I kill all these humans? Because within the kind of narrative arc of that story, and obviously that story between Genesis 6 and 9 is drawing on all sorts of different other traditions. So it's been kind of edited and redacted and shaped into a kind of a narrative. But within that narrative frame, you've got the sense that God's not pissed off. You know, he doesn't regret. He regrets that earlier, he floods the world because he regrets having made humankind because they have become so corrupt, mainly through having sex with divine beings. But that's another story in Genesis 6 that we can talk about. But so when he smells the smell of the sacrifice, of Noah's sacrifice, it's then when he says that he decides that he will never again flood the earth. And not just he will never again destroy humankind, he will never again destroy living creatures. So it's a kind of a covenant, a relationship, an agreement with non-human life as well as with human life, which I think is quite an important theological point given the state of the world and the climate crisis at the moment. It's quite an important point, you know, for these kind of particular Christians who think that the earth is ours to exploit no matter what. I think that's a really important theological point in those particular traditions. About
as far as the food goes, though, because they're so like he's butthurt about Adam eating this fruit. Like it's obvious that food is so important in the ancient Near East for the gods. So I kind of wondered if like that sacrifice he made to God, what made an impact where he kind of has this like I've starved before, like where I'm like feeling like I'm dying, and then a fresh plate of barbecue comes before you, some really fresh cooked meal, and then it's like I am thankful for everything. Like I am willing to start over, a fresh start, because that food was everything to me. I wondered if that food played that kind of role in God's mind of like, you know what, man is continually wicked, his heart's continually wicked, it says in the context there. So I'm thinking it's like, tomato, like, look, you made me some food and I'm really, I don't know if that made him convinced that he didn't want to do this anymore.
I think, yeah, I mean, I think because again, within the narrative arc of the story, this is the first sacrifice that's offered. I mean, yes, you've got Cain and Abel offering their sacrifices in Genesis 4, but then that whole generation, so that's pre-flood humanity. They've been wiped out. Noah is the only one left. And so this is the first kind of bonding moment, that new agreement with the new humanity that is going to, stem from Noah and his kids and their families. And so, yeah, it's exactly that thing about sitting around a table and this idea of forging intense relationships, social relationships. That's exactly what's going on with that sacrifice. And it's, and it is, he smells the pleasing smell, and it pleases God. He wants sacrifices. So yeah, then fast forward to the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, first in the 6th century BCE, and then again in 70 CE. The loss of the temple for those scribal communities who are producing a lot of these texts, the loss of the Jerusalem temple was huge. And so when the temple's not there, if you can't sacrifice, then that doesn't necessarily shift theologically the way in which you might understand those sorts of offerings to function for the deity.
I really, really appreciate your answer there. I was going to ask, I'm going to skip the least important ones because I really want to get to some of the questions from our audience. Of course, idols are technically a derogatory term for other gods, which is better understood, and you do not beat around the bush, shit gods. So you mind telling us what a shit god is and what the language is? And I want everyone to please get the book. I cannot brag enough about it. So please tell us what a shit god is, or better yet, an idol.
So we get the word idol from the Greek Bible. So in other words, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures. That's where this, and quite often the Greek term idol particularly translates a Hebrew word, gilulim, which is a plural term, which basically is best translated as shit gods. It comes from a word that means that's used of dung, or kind of rolled up, you know, like balls of dung, rolled up poo, basically. And it's a term that we particularly find in the book of Ezekiel and other kind of priestly type literature. And it's a way, again, of debasing cult statues of deities. So Yahweh probably had his own cult statues within certain worshipping communities. You know, obviously we have the prohibition on images in Deuteronomy and Exodus, which, you know, you don't tell people not to do something unless they're doing it. So the term gilulim is used as a deliberate way of really talking down, you know, it's shit talking basically. It's really talking down the cult statues of other deities, because don't forget, cult statues were understood to be the deity. They weren't just a representation or a symbol. They were understood to manifest the deity. So yeah, that's where that term comes from.
About Baal, where I use this recently because this is my new Bible. I'm like, okay, remember when Elijah is talking to the Baal, the priest of Baal, and he says, you know, where is your God? Did he go, and is he defecating? Now,
yeah, he's basically said, why is your God not answering you what your prayers? You know, maybe he's busy, maybe he's on journey, maybe he's taking a shit, is basically like what Elijah says to the prophets of Baal. Yeah, and it is that sense. So I mean, there was a sense that some, you know, in some cultures there was a, you know, it's perfectly well understood that deities might defecate. It's not something that we ever find ascribed directly to Yahweh, but that kind of taunt that we find in the story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal, you know, it shows that the kind of scatology played a big role in theology, and that's exactly what's going on with Ezekiel's language of the shit gods, the gilulim. It's kind of like trying to smear them with something, you know, render them dirty, and, you know, ritually dirty, as well as kind of conceptually base, I think.
This is going to sound a little awkward, but the next question I have is about the Sabbath and seventh day idea. There's a guy who's floated around on the internet. Those in the chat know. He's been very kind to me, don't get me wrong, but he's gone around bragging victory over all these academics that I've had on and saying we're all under a seventh day calendar. And this all started with the God of the Bible, a seventh day calendar. Therefore, we're all technically responsible, and you know, we are under this God's jurisdiction. So we are all technically sinners who need to repent to this God, because this is the true God. Look, we have 7 days. And I was reading the book. Right, I know. And I was reading the book. The origin of the seventh-day Sabbath was my question. Maybe you have a thought on, but you mentioned a Sumerian lament where Inanna is singing to Enlil because he is sleeping while his people and their land are in famine on page 256. Maybe I can read it, teasing people to really get this book. I can't tell you how much I'm impressed with this. The goddess Inanna traveled from her temple to Uruk to Nippur in the hope of rousing Enlil. Feigning my father's fanes lying down, she cried. May I soothe his heart. May I pacify his liver. May I direct my words to his distressed heart. Sitting on his lap, she sings him awake with the refrain, O sleeping one, how long will you sleep? Inanna's lament was considered so powerful that her cult singers recited it in her temple at Uruk on the 7th day of each month in the hope of appeasing the gods for any unknown misdemeanor which might prompt untimely or stimulated slumber. Precautionary measures were only sensible. Discerning the difference between a sleeping god and a sulking god was not always easy. Many centuries later, in the 6th century CE, Yahweh's worshippers were singing petitions to awaken him to the devastating aftermath of the Babylonian attack. Rouse yourself. Why do you sleep, O Yahweh? Awake. Do not cast us off forever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's lots of stuff to unpack there. I mean, the 7th day is what 7 is a very significant number in a lot of ancient Southwest Asian cultures. And so time is very commonly divided up. I mean, not always. I mean, in some contexts, like in certain Egyptian contexts, the number 10 is very important. But 7 is very common in a lot of ancient Southwest Asian cultures as a means of marking time, and probably primarily, scholars think, because that you could see 7 planets in the night sky, you know, with the naked eye at that time. So these seem to, you know, it was a particularly powerful, special number. So it's not unusual to have 7 pop up a lot across these cultures, and not unusual to have the idea of a period of time being 7 days was not unique to Yahweh worshipping cultures either. So that's one thing. I mean, the idea of the bit that you read is when I'm talking about the notion that for a lot of Yahweh's worshippers, inaction, divine inaction or divine neglect could be understood to reflect either a God who was sleeping or a God who had simply withdrawn. You know how we all kind of, you know, if you're kind of depressed or tired or sulky, you take to your bed and you just don't want to engage with anybody. Right. It's kind of a similar kind of thing for the gods of the ancient world. You know, they might just withdraw socially completely. And so when in that particular poem that I referred to in the Hebrew Bible, you know, arouse, you know, wake up, O arm of Yahweh, that's because that was written in the time of the Babylonian destruction and exile. So destruction of the temple, the exile of elites to Babylonia. And they're saying, you know, they're singing to Yahweh's arm, you know, his fighting arm, wake up, wake up. You have to kind of rescue us from enslavement in a foreign land. You have to come and fight for us. You know, they just assumed that his withdrawal is because he's sleeping, you know, so he has completely disappeared from their lives. So that was very common.
The idea of Sabbath meaning 7, but also is rest, is that this is predating the Bible by millennia. I mean, the Yahweh cult is late, Johnny come lately again, right, on this notion, but the unique way that they've kind of instrumented it to be, that might be unique, right? How they've made it into be, or is there a Sabbath that preceding this culture where they're resting with their God?
I mean, yeah, I mean, some scholars will certainly argue that in certain cults of particular deities that you had a Shabbat, a day of rest. So, and that was as much for the deity as it was for worshippers. But yeah, like I said, there's very little that is kind of purely innovative in some ways. Like when you're looking at these kinds of the ways in which the ritual calendar is organized, and the ways in which certain sacrifices function, the ways in which certain, you know, ideas about what a temple is, what a deity is, you know, there's I'm not saying there's nothing innovative, but the grand shape of things is not particularly exceptional in that sense. But I mean, I like the idea of, you know, we've got this sense that, you know, the Sabbath, you know, Shabbat is a day of reflection and kind of theological thinking, and not, you know, not working because you're meant to be focused very much on the idea of being in this relationship with the deity. But you know, you get a particular verse in Exodus in which, you know, Yahweh himself is talking, and he sort of says that, you know, on the 7th day he had to catch his breath because he was tired, you know, having made the universe in days 1 to 6. He was tired, or, you know, he was running out of puff on the 7th day.
You see that
so
in the
there
Hebrew,
is that
right?
sense of rest. Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Okay, so we're not
in
reading
Hebrew,
that.
yeah, in the Hebrew, in that particular verse in Exodus, it uses the same word that's used to describe the kind of catching, you know, someone who's been doing hard manual labor, kind of like sitting and resting and catching their breath like that. It's the same word that's used, which is a really nice image. I mean, it's a very companionable image, isn't it? Kind of likening it, kind of theologically, it's showing that God put all this exertion and work into creating this beautiful world. So in some ways, it's kind of nice.
Yeah. In some ways, and then in other ways, I kind of want to emphasize the ancient construction worker God was. In fact, he must be the first person who was ever making humans from clay, I suspect, right? I'm being sarcastic here to read a part of your book, page 277. Again, I love this, by the way. I cannot tell you. I'm like, oh, I pause the Audible, and then I go in and I write it down, and then I get the page and I'm highlighting. It's my Bible. Clay shaping bodies had long been a ritual actively undertaken by both gods and mortals. In a Sumerian myth, the ingenious god Enki and the birth goddess Nenma had crafted the first humans from clay. What's this? Peopling their temples, I think. Okay. Yeah. Peopling their temples, farms, and fields with worshippers devoted to their service. In a related tradition, the goddess Mami chanted an incantation as Enki trod the clay for her to shape into people. At Ugarit, it was processed similarly performed by El, who had made an exorcism goddess from clay to cure King Kurta. I shall create a remover of sickness, an expeller of disease. He fills his hands with the best of clay. He pinches off that which is used by a potter. Meanwhile, in Egypt, the god most frequently associated with the creation of humans was Khnum, who crafted all living things, including some gods, on his potter's will. I love that. You are the master of the will. Who is pleased to model on the will? You have made humans on the will. You have created the gods. You have modeled the small and large cattle. You have formed everything on your will each day in your name, Khnum, the potter. That sounds like the Bible, but way earlier.
Yeah. I mean, and that's the thing. It's like, I mean, clay shaping is, I mean, you know, the one that it was the most important substance in some ways within these particular cultures, because it's so, you know, it's there, it's everywhere. I mean, you need good quality clay to make kind of like a figurine or whatever, but it's also, it's the base stuff of life, you know, the understanding that humans are made from, not just humans, but other living beings were made from clay, as you've demonstrated, wasn't just a biblical kind of idea. It was a much older, far more widespread idea across ancient Southwest Asia. So yeah, the idea that humans made, you know, when humans made their figurines of gods out of clay, they were mimicking the gods themselves who made humans out of clay. So it's the primal matter of life in these particular cultures. But yeah, it's a lovely image, and yeah, like I think that's why it's so important to set these biblical texts within their broader cultural context, is because otherwise you get all sorts of claims being made about the innovative, unique status of certain theological ideas, and therefore they are so, you know, so exclusive that therefore they must be true. They're not. But it's, you know, they're all drawing on a much much wider, broader, richer cultural tradition, and it's just that Yahweh just happens to be one God among many, who, you know, but he just happens to be the God that's kind of survived into the modern day, you know, unlike Inanna or you know, which is such a shame. I'd much rather we had her still around.
I wish we knew a lot more too about these gods that come before, because we kind of only know from our tradition what's being preserved, and I just wish we knew a lot more. I have a few more questions. I have 3 more, in fact, and then I'd love to get in Q&A. And Dr. Stavrakopoulou, if I may, I would love to send you a gift in some way for your time, because I literally, like, I seriously appreciate you. And there's so many people who've been anticipating this. Right now, we have, to give you an example, 535 people watching live right now.
Wow.
Yes, we have a large audience watching, and I want to make sure I try to cover their super chats. So that means I'd like to send you, you know, some money for your time, because I value it. I seriously do. With that being said, if I could get my 3 questions and then we just try to get through the super chats, I'm asking you not to hate me in advance, just because, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. All right. So as far as the curse thing goes, speaking of curses and blessings, Cain gets a curse on his forehead. You mention in your book that priests would put a sign on their forehead or something in the temple, and the priests would wear a mark in the temple on their foreheads. Does this play any role in Cain's curse? You do say it does in some way. Can you tell us what's going on with that?
I think this is basically about amulets. So it's basically about so if you think about the way in which so in Shema in Deuteronomy, Yahweh via Moses tells the Israelites that they are to write the words of all this Torah, this law, you know, bind it on their hands and bind it on, you know, it should be like an amulet between their eyes. So this is the, you know, for those of who are familiar with kind of very traditional Jewish practice, this is tefillin, you know, so the little boxes or pouches that are worn on the head and on the hands. So these are kind of like almost like power words that act as amulets. Amulets aren't kind of just a good luck charms. They are apotropaics. In other words, they ward off harm, they ward off evil. And that's exactly what happens with the high priest. In certain biblical texts, the high priest has to kind of write the name belonging to Yahweh on his head before he goes into the temple, because it almost like protects him from the dangerous glare and presence of the deity. And so in the same way, even though God is mega pissed off with Cain because he offers the wrong kind of sacrifice, poor guy, not even told the rules, do you know what I mean? And he like offers the wrong kind of sacrifice. And then he kills his brother, but you know, which is the bigger crime, let's face it. And then so, you know, he's expelled again, like his parents were expelled from Eden. Cain is then expelled from the presence of Yahweh, and he has to kind of wander around, you know, to the edges of the world. And he worries that he's going to become, you know, he's going to be a target. He's going to be a target for hate crime, you know, and sort of vigilantes. And so Yahweh writes a protective mark on him, which again seems to, so it's the idea that writing, not just the words that are written, but the actual presence of the written words of any kind of word, the presence of writing was almost like a magical, powerful amulet, and it could protect. That's why you have writing in tombs and that kind of thing. It protects the dead in their tombs, much like these amulets on the high priest's head and on Cain's head protect them from harm as well.
This was practiced well before Yahweh in
it's
Samaria.
very common. I mean, that's why, like, so, you know, stamp seals or cylinder seals, these little things that are pressed and rolled, you know, inscribed, pressed or rolled into wet clay to seal jars of olives or to seal documents or whatever. They also functioned as little amulets. You wore them on the body. They were made of stone or sometimes bone. And they weren't just jewelry. They were like protective amulets as well, with like writing on them. So it's all a part and parcel of this much broader world in which words like inscriptions and images worn on the body could play this kind of protective role, like an amulet.
It's almost like people who feel lucky when they wear their cross and they're out somewhere and they just feel like they have protection. Well put. Okay, so there's this really old face. 9,500 years ago, worshipers most desire to be face to face with God, right? In the Bible, we talk about it. Moses just wants to be face to face, and he actually is face to face with God on one account. And then, you know, there's even this weird hint in the New Testament. Marcion seemed to reflect when he says like Jesus said that no one has seen God except him. So how is Moses seeing God if he's saying that no one has? So you kind of wonder if Marcionism has some leg up in the New Testament. I don't know. I'll leave that up for you guys to debate. Point is, everyone wants to be face to face with God, but they're also terrified at what might become of this. So you mentioned this this concept of the Jericho skull that's 9,500 years old, possibly older. Do you think this stems from that far back? I mean, we're talking about Göbekli Tepe kind of.
When I'm talking about the Jericho skull, so this is like Neolithic, this object, and you know, and I'm sure like your viewers will know, but these are these plastered skulls that we find. So somebody underwent head modification when they were a child, when they were born, they were selected for this process when they were born. They had their heads bound and, you know, then lived a normal life, and whenever they died in adulthood, buried under the floors of their homes, which was a normal kind of process then in those particular Neolithic cultures. Sometime not too long after, the body is exhumed, the head is removed, the remnants of the flesh and skin scraped away, and then the face is reshaped with clay and then painted, you know, sort of it's rubbed shiny, it's kind of given a red pigment or hue. Some have little moustaches painted on them, some have kind of like these wigs of like rush hair, and I mean, they're really super cool. But these heads sit up on their own. They're kind of reshaped and remolded with plaster to sit up on their own, like the way they sit up in museum cabinets today. They just kind of sit there. And it's a way of creating an otherworldly being. And I use this example of the Jericho skull in my book to talk about the ways in which, even without talking, without touching, it's that sense of being face to face with another being, even an otherworldly being, as the Jericho skulls are meant to represent. You know, we don't know whether they were ancestors or gods. I don't think they were either. I think they are just some kind of otherworldly being, because these faces were remade and reshaped several times over for almost like different ritual purposes. But it's that sense of coming face to face with the otherworldly, and that's what that really kind of represents. So like, then it's not directly related to what we have going on in biblical traditions, but it's that same sense of just how important faces are. That's why we see faces wherever we go. Do you know what I mean? You see faces in the clouds, in the shape of clouds, whatever. It's because I think we're built as humans to see other social beings and to recognize them. It's like why we're fonder of animals that have faces that are a little bit like ours, rather than, you know, eyes round here and nose is down here. I don't know.
It's a good point. Like it's like a proto evolutionary explanation of what ended up creating what we ended up believing about things.
Yeah, I mean, some cognitive science of religion scholars who kind of look at the ways in which certain kinds of patterns or tropes of behavior are very much bound up with our evolutionary cognitive genetics and development and context, and they would argue that that it's a basic kind of human premise to imagine our gods as like us, basically.
Thank you for that answer. I've got one more, and this is I'd love for you to take whatever amount of time you want with this. It's a complicated question I've asked myself on MythVision for many years now, actually. And then I'd love to get into our super chats. Like I said, I want to gift you with something for your time today. And no more question super chats, please. I put that down in the banner because they take time and we don't want to leave people hanging. You're more than welcome to show love and support, a little shout out, but I really don't want to take too much more time of Dr. Stavrakopoulou's coming on here. So she wants to see my email and not go, that guy again. No, thank you. So my last question is this. What are a few reasons you think a historical Jesus, because you started your research with this question, exist over the mythicist model, whatever model you want to put? Are there a few things in your head that make you go the direction there was probably a guy? And can you give us those examples?
Yeah, there was probably a guy so not the guy that's described or talked about in the Gospels, certainly not the guy that's described or talked about in, you know, some of the later Christian traditions and texts. There was probably a guy, and the only reason I say that is because of the relatively short period of time in between, you know, and I'm kind of radical in a lot of ways, but I'm not that radical. So I think it's a relatively short period of time between the writings of, say, Paul, which are like mid-50s, and the likely execution that occurred. I reckon there was a guy who was executed. And my main reasons are probably a lot of the stuff that's said about John the Baptist, interestingly, I think that's trying to kind of, it makes sense to me that there was a John the Baptist type. We know there are lots of these kinds of figures wandering around. Honey, the circle drawer, is one of my favorites. He was like kind of this failed kind of figure. I know he wasn't failed. He was very popular. But he was that, you know, he had his methods, basically drawing circles and standing in them. But, you know, the kind of John the Baptist Jesus thing, that looks to me like a massive kind of polemic as a way of trying to say, what's the relationship between these two figures? You know, John the Baptist had his head cut off. This Jesus guy, you know, was crucified. So you've got two kind of executed figures who have been brought together. That to me suggests that there's somebody is trying to reconcile these two popular kind of cult leaders. So it's that and the kind of the relatively early date of the Paul stuff. But, you know, but Paul didn't meet the guy. Paul's very clear that he didn't meet the guy at all. So who knows? But whoever he was, I suspect that at the very least, there was probably a guy or maybe a series of guys or leaders, but, you know, one of them was executed and it was devastating. I don't think he resurrected from the dead. Equally, I don't think that a lot of those reports of encountering Jesus after he's been crucified, I don't think they necessarily are indexing the idea that these people thought they'd seen a resurrected body. I think, you know, this was, people encountered the dead and the shades of the dead all of the time in those cultures. So I don't see that as kind of proof of anything at all.
I agree.
So I kind of flip on that. Yeah, it's more probable than improbable that some guy existed and was executed. probably had some kind of relationship with a kind of John the Baptist type figure. But beyond that, who knows?
So you wouldn't rest your soul on this? Oh, yeah.
I know.
Yeah, right. Okay.
I like gambling.
Yeah, I like to tell people that if you're wanting to make sure you don't go to hell, become a MythVision member of the YouTube channel or join the Patreon. You know, do you want to really risk it? I don't think you do. So please do so. All right, I'm going to your super chats. And once again, thank you for everybody who supported us today. I want to just get that out of the way. Let's get to your questions. No more questions, super chats. Let's roll. Constellation Pegasus, thank you for the super chat. I hope this isn't too off topic, but what's the opinion on Hinduism being the oldest organized religion?
Oh, I don't know. It depends what you mean by religion. It depends what you mean by organized. It depends what you mean by oldest. Hinduism isn't one of my areas of specialty at all, so I feel very unqualified to comment on it. But I think like most religious movements or you know, bodies, or I think it's got very, very ancient roots. When we see it as becoming organized as such, I mean, it's hard to know. I mean, is Judaism really organized? Is Christianity really organized? I don't know. You know, because you look at the differences in Christianity alone, there are so many different flavors and so many disagreements. It's hard to know. So I don't know what the opinion is on that, but there's a great guy at Rutgers University, his name escapes me, who is an expert on these kinds of things. So look him up, he'll know.
Thank you so much. No, and you know, just so you know, I have a lot of academics. The best thing they do say is that's out of my field, or I'm not certain. I wouldn't want to give you that. And so it's a respectable response. Don't mind me using the rag here from time to time. I just, you know, we talk about tears too, where the water flows and stuff. Anyway, that's stuff you go into in your book. Constellation, thank you. ScholarVid, throughout your career, you have experienced significant pushback from the universities where you've taught against some of the hypotheses you've put forth. Is that true? And I'm going to put your book up while you're doing stuff. So
I've not had pushback from the universities I've taught at. In the UK, it's very different from the US. In the US, there's a lot of places that teach, you know, that do biblical studies and stuff, which are very confessional. And so you kind of have to sign some faith declaration before you can teach there. The UK is very different. It tends to be, theoretically at least, very secular. I mean, obviously, a lot of my colleagues are Christian or Jewish or Muslim or whatever. So I've not had pushback from the universities. I have had pushback from students. I have had pushback from individual staff and colleagues. But yeah, nothing that I can't handle. So yeah, it's fine.
Well, can you give us one example? Just what's one that you would say is a big one that always comes up?
I think the one that always kind of has stayed with me is when I was very early in my actually when I was teaching at Oxford. I taught there for 2 or 3 years when I was doing my postdoctoral work. And there was a theological training college that was kind of affiliated to the university. And I was giving the main university lectures on the Hebrew Bible and the history of Israel and that kind of thing. And I was told that I had been blacklisted by students at this particular theological college because they felt that A, I was an atheist, B, I was a heretic, C, you know, blah, 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 blasphemy, blah, 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 all the usual stuff. But that stayed with me because that was the first time. I was very early in my career. I'd only just finished my doctorate. And I was like, why would you not come to the Oxford University lectures just because you don't like the woman? Oh, woman lecturing.
Yeah, that's something I bet we could have an hour conversation about what your life in your career has been like as a woman. But yeah, maybe we can cover that at some point. I'd love that. Thank you so much for that. Esoterica, my buddy Justin Sledge, Dr. Justin Sledge. Do you think there is any continuity between your study to the later Shi'ur? Is that Shi'ur Qamar?
Shi'ur Qamar. I talk about it in the book. Yeah. So this is a particular kind of mystical Jewish tradition, supposedly arising in kind of Roman era Palestine, but we find most of the text beginning to circulate around Europe primarily in about like, 11th, 12th century CE. And the text literally means the measure of the body, and it's a way of talking about various aspects of the divine nature of God, of the Jewish God, but using the size and measurements of his body parts. So in that text, for example, the length of his nose is the same as the length of his little finger. But, you know, he's got this massive body, and it's a very mystical text. It's kind of like such a specialist esoteric text. It's got lots of links with the sort of medieval forms of Kabbalah. So yeah, I talk about that particular text in the book.
Yeah, in one of your parts in the book, I always get a chuckle when I come across it, because I was an evangelical. Like, God was spirit, which meant invisible, which meant, you know, other than the body of Jesus, which, you know how that works. You go into all of that. But the idea, God is hung more than a horse. Okay. Like, God's has the biggest penis. So for those guys out there who think you're going to compete, we just might as well give up and stay what we are, mortals. Your book is very blunt. So I feel like these blunt conversations are necessary to just point out this is what the God of the Bible is. So Impossible is Nothing. Thank you for the super chat. Just got Dr. Stavrakopoulou's book from Amazon. Loving the education. I was hoping to luck out like Derek and get the blinged out UK cover, but alas, I got the basic American cover. Oh, well.
Oh, I'm so sorry about that. It's so, I don't understand why. I mean, publishers know better than me. I don't understand why the American publishers, who are a great publisher, Knopf, but why they decided to go with the red cover and a picture of God's dad driving a car. Which looks like to me driving a car. But yeah, yeah, thank you so much for buying the book. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I did pin it at the top of the chat. Get you a copy. I don't know why I got this copy. I live in North Carolina in the United States, so I don't understand it, but thank you for that support. And I did put that up there, so please get it. Is it Bonapal? Thank you for the super chat. Was Yahweh a Midianite god before becoming an Israelite god?
I don't know about whether he was a Midianite god. I mean, we know so little about these particular kind of designations that are given to particular territorial groups. But certainly, I suspect he came. I mean, we've got some of the oldest poetry in the Hebrew Bible gives him an origin, a location in what is now southern Jordan, basically. So I think he came from like that kind of red wilderness area. That we associate. So what's called Edom in the Hebrew Bible is now southern Jordan. So some scholars, some of my colleagues are really keen on the Midianite hypothesis as a means of, you know, so has this god somehow come up from what is now sort of the Arabian Peninsula and up? It's possible. But yeah, I think the most we can say is that he's kind of comes from down that way rather than up in the north, as earlier generations of scholars used to argue. But yeah, I'd go with kind of, yeah, he comes from the southern Jordan area.
It's a complex issue because the data is not great. Thank you for the super chat. We have 650 people watching. Hit the like button. Get the book now, because the apocalypse is coming. And when it comes, all you got to do is show the book and they won't hurt you. Dead serious. Jordan Kelp, thank you for the super chat. Do you think the original temple in Jerusalem had a large cultic statue of Yahweh? Thanks to both of you for the work y'all do. Thank you.
Do you know what? If I had to put money on it, I'd say that there was a cult statue of Yahweh in the Jerusalem temple in the Iron Age. I don't know how big it would have been. I mean, you know, even within Mesopotamian, you know, we know that they had like all sorts of different kind of cult statues, but even in Mesopotamian examples weren't particularly big. But if I had to put money on it, I'd say, yeah, I reckon there was probably a human-shaped, you know, an anthropomorphic cult statue of Yahweh in the Jerusalem temple at some early stage. You know, was it there up until the destruction of the Babylonian temple? I don't know, but we do have some interesting, you know, that language in the Hebrew Bible that talks about the Babylonian kings coming in and taking what's normally translated as vessels of Yahweh. It's the same vessels term that's used on the Moabite stone, which is dated much earlier to the 9th century, about King Mesha of Moab and the Omrid dynasty of Israel. That too talks about the vessels of Yahweh being dragged. Vessels can also, it doesn't just mean, you know, bits and pieces, bowls and spoons and stuff. It you know, I think that probably means cult objects. So yeah, if I put money on it, I'd say yeah.
Thank you, Jordan. Wonderful question. Evangelical Humanist says, happy anniversary, Derek. Thank you. 15 years. She's put up with me that long.
Happy anniversary.
Thank you. Thank you. I am lucky. I am definitely lucky. My Asherah is stuck by my side and I don't plan on ever getting rid of her. Stop scamming, man. I'm going to do better than Yahweh on this one. Stop scamming, man. Hi. Any thoughts on whether or not Solomon existed?
Oh yeah, I really do. Do you know what? It's so, I see the David and Solomon stories as reflecting two competing foundation traditions. That's why they're both kind of credited with building temples. So, oh yeah, it's David that says, I'm going to build a temple, and, and he picks the place, and he gets, the threshing floor, and he sorts it all out. Oh, but then it's actually his son Solomon that builds it. I think that these are two competing traditions about the foundation myth of the temple. And Solomon's name itself is really interesting because it looks like, it's kind of like it's such a common kind of construct of a name. But you have this really interesting story about David and his son with Bathsheba, this son that dies, and and the son is called Yedidiah, which basically means beloved of Yah. David's name is a play on kind of though beloved as well. So, and Solomon's name, it just all looks these all look like kind of typological names in some ways. So I doubt that we can talk about a historical David or a historical Solomon. I'm not saying that they're not these figures aren't drawn on older kind of traditions and myths about founders, perhaps legendary founders, perhaps some more kind of sketchy historical figures. I don't know. But yeah, if I would put money on there being a cult image of Yahweh in the temple, I wouldn't put money on Solomon and David existing. Put it that way.
Thank you so much. Stop scanning, man. Doc Pluromana, where the Tanakh speaks of God's anthropomorphism or anthropopatheism, Targumists seem to avoid such language, and the LXX seems to have toned it down as well in Deuteronomy. Is this stylistic rather than theological tendencies?
It's a bit of both. So when it comes to the LXX, some traditions, some texts in the LXX may well reflect earlier versions of the Hebrew than those that we find in the Masoretic tradition today. You get some of that in Samuel and Kings. It kind of looks a bit different. So it may be that it's a deliberate, and obviously with the Greek, we're looking at the 3rd century BC at the earliest as to when these texts started to come into being, these Greek texts, these Greek translations or versions. So by that point, I think, the idea, there's a growing discomfort with the idea of God's body, particularly if some of the LXX texts came from in and around the Alexandria kind of cultural sphere of influence, which was very much taken with certain sorts of notions of the immateriality of the divine, certain sort of philosophical ideas. So yeah, so I think in some texts it is theological, in some it's stylistic, but there's a real blurring of the two, because particularly in the Targums as well, by this point, the idea of God having a body has been, the rabbis are still quite comfortable with it, with the idea of God having a body, and they're very comfortable about talking about God's body and depicting him anthropomorphically. But when it comes to what you do and how you comment on certain scripture, whether it's biblical texts or other authoritative texts, there's a certain kind of reverence, the same reverence that we see, in which you don't say the name Yahweh aloud. So it might be written in the Hebrew, but you don't say it aloud. And that seems to come about relatively early too. So it's a combination, I think, of both stylistic and theological.
Thank you so much for that, Doc. Thanks for the support. Stop scamming, man. Does Deuteronomy appear to have a 6th century writing style?
Wow, that's a very specific question. Yeah, a lot of you see, I see Deuteronomy as like, in terms of writing style, some parts of Deuteronomy look kind of a bit older. So some of the curses and blessings, for example, some scholars argue that this looks like a kind of a classical biblical Hebrew as opposed to a kind of a later kind of biblical. My feeling very much is that Deuteronomy as a whole reflects, there's obviously some bits of really ancient poetry at the end of Deuteronomy, which looks much older than 6th century. So some of those poems at the end, like in Deuteronomy 32, for example. But yeah, my feeling is that ideologically, when you read Deuteronomy, this is very much about a community who is not in the land. And let's take the land as being Jerusalem or whatever. This is about, this seems to me to be a post-exilic either reframing or manifesto of certain land territorial ideologies about a people who know what it's like to lose that territory and land, and have either just got back into it or are coming back into it. So to me, yeah, it looks kind of more, it actually looks more 5th century ideologically and theologically. It's very difficult to kind of be specific in terms of writing style. But some of that very old poetry at the end of Deuteronomy is certainly looks to have older bits in it.
Thank you so much for that. I appreciate everybody viewing. 656 people. Over the last few years, stop scamming, man. Thank you. Has academia gotten any wiser as the origin and etymology of Yahweh?
No, everyone's still arguing about it now. Yeah, so there are various different theories. One is that the name derives, like etymologically speaking, that the name might derive from a verb meaning to blow. So could this index the idea of Yahweh being a storm god? You know, that will kind of make sense. Another possible kind of origin could be the idea of strength or striving, you know, all of these different things have been brought into play with Yahweh's name. But yeah, the long and short of it is very few people believe the biblical the biblical sort of interpretation of his name, which is that it comes from the, you know, the verb to be. Not very many scholars hold to that biblical idea. So yeah, we don't really know. We don't really know where it's from at all.
Well, thank you for that. Stop scamming, man. Oh, Flamio, why does Yahweh need money or food?
Oh, well, Yahweh needs money because his priests need money, because that's how you run a temple. But yeah, Yahweh needs food because he likes it, he enjoys it. There's a brilliant psalm. In one of the Psalms, Yahweh, it looks to have been written after the temple was destroyed in the 6th century. And Yahweh says, you know, I don't need your sacrifices now. I don't need food. The whole world and everything in it is mine to eat, basically. You know, I don't need your sacrifices. The idea is that, again, it's that idea that animal sacrifice or any kind of food sacrifice is about the relationship between the donor and the recipient and the divine recipient. So yeah, but he likes the smell of certain things. He likes the smell of incense, and incense wasn't just burned, you know, in braziers in his temples. It was also kind of sprinkled on his food. So like, it's kind of like a garnish. So that's what he realized. It's the smell really pleases him, makes him happy.
It's very human. Thank you so much for that. Constellation Pegasus. Interesting to think 200 to 300 years ago, we could get into trouble talking like this. Good to be in the 21st century.
That's true. But yeah, but then don't forget, like, there are some parts of the world where if I were to talk like this in public, it would still be. I've had emails from people based in the Middle East, a couple from Pakistan in particular, who had managed to get a copy of my book. I'm loving it. They're humanists, secularists. They're doing quite a, but obviously it's incredibly dangerous for them to be doing that kind of work, or any kind of to be irreligious or atheist is really difficult. But yeah, I do feel very privileged to be in the place and life that I am.
That is a wonderful super chat. Great response. Gnostic Informant, my buddy Neil. Thank you so much, Neil, for the super chat. Go subscribe to my buddy's channel. There seems to be a ton, and that's the gentleman I introduced you to before the show. Yeah. There seems to be tons of common tropes between the Inanna Ishtar descent story, Eleusinian mysteries, and Isis and Osiris myths. Do you think these ideas extend to Christianity?
I think possibly, because one of the things about a lot of these texts, that even if you've got a, you know, a very early Sumerian myth, or you know, like a Babylonian myth, like these texts were, you know, carried on circulating for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. You know, they were copied, and you know, so they became a part. You know, there were huge libraries across ancient Southwest Asia. So I think there's a sense in which certain kind of scribal communities, certain kinds of, you know, the intelligentsia in certain communities, they were very familiar with these kinds of stories and myths and tropes. And I do think there was a lot of traffic, you know, and you know, it used to be like, you know, 50 years ago, people used to talk about the traffic of kind of like cultural ideas going from west to east, you know, from Greece. And I mean, obviously I love Greece being like great in whatever it does because I'm biased, I'm half Greek, but you know, there was a sense in which kind of there was a lot of cultural traffic going one way from Greece to the east. But recently, you know, scholarship of the last 20 years or so, particularly with classicists, have really started to understand what ancient Southwest Asian scholars have been telling them for donkey's years, that actually the traffic was massively the other way as well, from you know, going westwards into the Mediterranean. And so I think a lot of these myths and tropes were certainly circulating much earlier than people used to think. And I'm sure that there are some of those ideas you do see them working out in Christianity. Look at the iconography. Early Christian iconography is really interesting when you want to look at some of these motifs in particular, I think. Don't just rely on the text.
Yeah, there's so much. Oof, I love this. I'm glad I got my questions out of the way, so I can't be selfish. Stop scamming, man. Thank you again. Some of the Old Testament has God demanding incense and burnt offerings off others, abhorring them.
Yeah.
Is it just because God wearied of offerings from the impious, or does this represent a different theology?
Most of the context in which we find God saying, I despise your sacrifices, like he does in the book of Amos and similarly in Isaiah, most of those are very context specific, and it is about the insincerity, not just the insincerity of sacrifice. So it's kind of like rich people making a big song and dance about, you know, oh, look at these amazing sacrifices. Let's have another big feast and another big sacrifice. And he's saying he won't accept those sacrifices. He hates them because these are the gains, if you like, of social oppression and injustice. So he's often, when he's saying, I hate and I abhor your sacrifices, in the next breath, you know, in the next verse, he's saying, because you trample on the backs of the poor, because you do, you know, because you exploit this, because you take this. So there's very much a sense in which ritual offerings weren't something separate from the social kind of values of other aspects of society. So he's saying that, yeah, you might have all this money to offer up, you know, these lavish sacrifices and offerings, but that means shit to me if you can't treat your next door neighbor with kindness. And you know, and again, that's kind of, you know, a lot of people are really down on the Hebrew Bible. It's kind of saying, oh, it's the bad God, and you know, it's not at all. I mean, there's a huge amount of kind of social texture in those texts, and I think that's an example there of when you get kind of the very negative polemics against sacrifice, but normally because it's got a message about social justice on the flip side of it.
Thank you so much. Abel Chavez, thank you for the super chat. I heard or read that the name Yahweh has a correlation with the 4 letters of our DNA. Do you know anything about this? Perhaps we are making a god of ourselves and thus reincarnation in a long run.
I don't know anything about DNA. I don't know anything. I've not heard about this theory that the name Yahweh has a correlation with the 4 letters. I mean, one way to put the bollocks on that is to say, I mean, Yahweh's name was probably just Yah. You know, in inscriptions that, you know, we often see it as Yah or Yahu, just 2 letters. So, yeah, I do think we are trying to make gods of ourselves all the time, however. But yeah, I've not heard of that.
Me neither. Thank you for that super chat. Hengfa, do you know of a myth, I believe, out of Mesopotamia in which El goes to a dinner party and gets crazy, stumbled down drunk?
Yeah, I talk about it in the book. It's not a Mesopotamian myth, it's an Ugaritic myth. And I deal with that. El, the high god, is basically has a drinking party, invites all the gods round, things get kind of chaotic. El stumbles home and sort of basically pisses and shits himself and falls over. He doesn't fall over. This is about a kind of divine, it's got some of those motifs about divine descent into another worldly realm, a bit like Inanna sort of descending into the underworld. It's got kind of some similarities with it. But yeah, it's written on the same tablet, is written a hangover cure, which is the first, which again I talk about in the book, is the first known reference to the use of the hair of the dog as a hangover cure. And in that particular text, it literally is the hair of a dog that's put on the forehead. But, you know, it's incredible how we get this expression in our own culture about the hair of the dog as a hangover cure. So, yeah, check it out. It is in the book. But, yeah, it's a myth from Ugarit. So, late Bronze Age.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, it's in the book. Get the book. I cannot emphasize that enough. We almost have 700 people watching. Doc Pleuromonot, if parallels with the Sumerian Dilmun and Eden Pass academic sniff test, is it potentially easier to identify a historical location based on a more accurate myth geography than the ambiguity in Genesis?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, so some people think that Dilmun is a particular island, which it seems to have been in later Mesopotamian texts. But Dilmun also had this kind of mythological role as well. It was kind of like, you know, before the gods had given you know, had given the gifts of kind of the cultural kind of qualities to humankind. So is it easier to identify a historical location based on more accurate myth geography than the ambiguity in Genesis? That's interesting too, because when I read the stuff in Genesis, to me it seems to be speaking about Lebanon. It's that kind of focus on trees, and in lots of different ancient Southwest Asian myths, Lebanon in particular was a place associated, you know, with the cedars of Lebanon. This was the divine garden of the gods. This is the kind of the sacred forest that Humbaba or Huawa in Sumerian, Humbaba guards. So some of that Genesis material and some of the ways in which Eden is described in older biblical texts, like some of the Psalms, in Ezekiel, for example, that seems to me to sound more like the kind of the sacred forest, which for some Sumerian communities was pretty much Lebanon. So yeah, I don't know if the Dillman Eden thing will pass the sniff test, but there are similarities. But yeah, I've always kind of, my hunch would be that it's Lebanon, really, Eden.
Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate that, Doc. Thank you, Dr. Stavrakopoulou, for coming back to MythVision. Is it possible to believe that Christians believe God is both corporeal and non-corporeal, given the Trinity? Loved your book.
That's a really, thank you for saying you got my book. That's a really interesting question. Is it possible to believe that Christians believe God? Yeah, and not so much given the Trinity, it's more given the Christian notion of incarnation. I mean, you know, for Christians, that was one big reason why Christian theologians were very happy to move away from ideas of an anthropomorphic God and a bodied God, because for them, it wouldn't make sense, you know, to have Jesus, you know, why, like, in some ways, you know, Jesus is the kind of, you couldn't get the idea of Jesus being an incarnation of God himself if it weren't for the fact that you had much earlier in the religious DNA things like cult statues of the god, things like the notion of God as having a male body, blah, blah, blah. Equally, you want to kind of, for Christians, it's the idea that this body has to be human in order for it to properly die, in order for it to properly resurrect, and That's really important too. So in some ways, yeah, Christians, I think the incarnation, the doctrine of the incarnation helps to kind of manage that tension and anxiety about divine corporeality and incorporeality. But then there are some Christians that do believe that God has a body. So, for example, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, some of those communities have very strong theologies in which God still has a body. So yeah, I think yeah, the Trinity is a bit of a problem for Christians in some ways, but yeah, it's more the incarnation that's the biggie, I think, about this corporeal incorporeal tension.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. Thank you, Chidi, for the super chat, and thank you for breaking 700 viewers. We're 703 viewers right now. Hit that like button. Get her book. I cannot emphasize this enough. It is a must absolute have. Better than the Bible itself. Liliana Stone, loving her book. I have the red cover and plan to get the blue and gold when we visit London in July.
Thank you. Oh, enjoy London. I grew up in London. It's the best city in the world.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope that you enjoyed the cover as much as I do. Joel Pearson, should temples show lit smoky gold idols again?
Oh, I'd love that. You know, I mean, that's one of the things that I particularly like about Eastern Christian churches. It's like, you know, whether it's Greek Orthodox or Russian Orthodox, whatever, go big on the bling. I mean, that's what, you know, make this as an extraordinary otherworldly place. So yeah, I mean, in some ways, a lot of Christian churches already have extended this idea about kind of cult statues of, you know, gorgeous gold shiny cult statues of Jesus and Mary and the saints and blah blah blah. You know, but then within certain Jewish traditions too, you know, the way in which the Torah scroll is dressed and accessorized and paraded and venerated, and, you know, is extraordinary too. To have that, it's almost like it takes the place of a cult statue. But yeah, just generally more incense, more bling. I'm very much up for that in sacred spaces.
Thank you so much, Joel. Inquisitive mind, I'm the ghost of MythVision, and my question is, where does the Islamic god Allah come from?
What, in terms of the name or in terms of culturally? I mean, culturally, I mean, Allah is basically you know, just like ale, it just means deity. So in that sense, it comes very much from the ancient, what we call the, you know, the ancient Middle East. But yeah, who knows? I mean, it may well be that there is a desert origin to that particular deity too. We don't know. In terms of the relationship between Allah and Ale, just like the relationship between Yahweh and Ale, I think there probably is one back in the kind of ancient divine DNA somewhere, way back in the story of these deities, emergence. But yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if somewhere along the line there is a common ancestor.
Thank you so much for that. Robert, thank you for the super chat, showing some love. Just getting through these here as we're wrapping up. I had one interesting question, if I can. The Messiah rides a donk. Where is the oldest evidence of Yahweh worship from?
It depends what kind of evidence you want. If you want evidence from biblical texts, then obviously you get some of that really old poetry that I talked about. Deuteronomy 32 is an example, some of the stuff at the end of Genesis. In terms of non-biblical evidence, one of the earliest references to Yahweh is probably the Mesha stela that I mentioned earlier, 9th century, written by King Mesha of Moab. So Moab is one of the Transjordanians, so basically what is Jordan now, who talks about Yahweh's temple and Yahweh being the God of Israel, the kingdom of Israel, the territory. Yeah, so that's, I think, the probably, in terms of uncontested archaeological evidence, that's one of the earliest attestations of the evidence of Yahweh worship, because we've got mention of the divine name, references to temples, to, you know, a sacrifice, you know, certain sorts of sacrifices and rituals being performed, the idea of this God as a particular patron of a particular royal household and territory and that kind of stuff.
Thank you.
So yeah, it's early Iron Age, basically.
I really appreciate that. Cam's Kaz, thank you so much for the super sticker. Really appreciate the support. Let's see if we can get, like Gnostic Informa said, get 500 likes. Let's make those likes happen. Almost there. I just want to make sure I didn't leave anyone hanging here. I apologize, but I really didn't want any more questions. Thanks. Great book. Dr. S is fabulous. Yeah. You. My buddy Jonathan Pierce, go check him out. A Tippling Philosopher. Subscribe. I actually was on his channel this morning hanging out with him. So we all love your work. And then the last one, why no one compares Yahweh with the Mesopotamian god Ea or Ea. Don't they have similar myth role and roles? Couldn't Ea, am I pronouncing this properly, be the root of Yah?
In terms of, I mean, people do compare them, but the Mesopotamian traditions that we have about Ea are kind of tend to be older. In terms, you know, textually, just tend to be older than the stuff that we have. I don't. Well, you're looking at, oh, this is where we get into philology, and Hebrew is very different in terms of as a language from the East Semitic forms of. So Akkadian is like an East Semitic kind of form. Equally, Sumerian is a language all of its own. It's not related. And it's what's incredible about Sumerian. It's not related to any other language family. So like the way that Hebrew is related to Phoenician and related to Moabite and Sumerian is not related to anything, which is quite incredible. So people do kind of compare Yahweh with some high gods, but Yahweh is such a late player on the stage. You know, by the time he pops up, you know, early Iron Age, like the Mesopotamian gods have been around for, you know, for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Yeah. But yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm sure have a look at the work of Nicholas Wyatt, and who else would be helpful on this. Mark S. Smith might have some interesting stuff on those two deities.
Thank you so much. Comms Cause, always wonder why all the gods to choose from, why Yahweh, why that particular one. We'll try and get the book. Definitely get the book. I would say the influence is obviously, well, it depends on the influence culturally you're speaking of, and Christianity has helped the West, if you will, overall try to reach that. Thank you so much for that super chat. Did you want to answer like why that particular one? Wouldn't you say it's just it became the most influential with the Christianity?
I mean, in terms of why Yahweh in an ancient context, why was it Yahweh that particularly kind of rose to prominence? You know, because obviously Ebal was kind of around, knocking around. It was part of a polytheistic context. You know, how come this kind of prioritization of Yahweh? We don't really know. Partly, I suspect it's because Yahweh worship was very much tied to the political elites of statehood, and so was a patron deity, a personal patron deity to certain sorts of like royal families, like the Omrids in the Northern Kingdom of Israel. So I suspect that's why that deity gets promoted more and more and more, till eventually they become kind of the state deity. But yeah, I think it's primarily due to Christianity that it's because Christianity started off as a cult, a Jewish cult, and it's very difficult to really tell the difference, in some ways between Christianity and Judaism in Christianity's earliest kind of couple of centuries anyway. So yeah, it's once Christianity gets kind of once it's kind of approved of by the Roman Empire and becomes one of the kind of, I don't want to say state, kind of imperial religions, but it's basically becomes particularly promoted in the Roman Empire, that's when it really kicks off.
My final question, and with the 718 people watch, please get her book, like this chat, leave a comment even after the live. What do you think about the Mount Ebal curse tablet that was discovered? Are we waiting for peer review? And do you think it's going to come up, is going to flop? What do you think's going to happen if you were going to predict? Do you think he's overstretching everything?
Yeah. And in a way, I can, to be generous, I can understand overstretching, because in a time when getting funding for digs is so hard and getting funding for any kind of projects is so hard, you kind of want to sell it to those people that are going to, it's kind of, a lot of it is like evangelical Christian funded digs that are doing this. So it's overstretching it. I don't think it's like, no one in my field is excited about, we're not like, oh my God, this changes everything, because we don't even know, they haven't even opened the text. B, there's not enough to go on from what they do have. And C, never kind of say anything until we've had proper peer review. So, but yeah, I don't imagine it's going to set the world on fire, put it that way.
Thank you so much for your time, your energy. Everybody go get the book. It is on Amazon. It's pinned in the chat. It's in the description if you're watching this after this live. Check out all of our other works as well. And MythVision's Patreon, please consider joining us. I am melting in this garage, and if you don't mind, I'd like to wrap things up here. I seriously look forward to reading your other works, and of course reading, and we'll do another episode on this again. There's more in your book, but there's just not enough time. And so please don't go anywhere. Never forget, ladies and gentlemen, we are MythVision.